Joining me now for another edition of the Knicks Film School pregame show with the Knicks, welcoming in the Indiana Pacers, another team that just traded for a former Toronto Raptor, looking to take a leap this season. Also a team that the Knicks did business with this offseason, and they will be welcoming Obi Toppin back to Madison Square Garden for the first time since that trade. We welcome in for the very first time to Knicks Film School from Fieldhouse Files, the Fieldhouse File podcast. It is Mr. Scott Agness. Scott, welcome to Knicks Film School, sir.
Yeah, appreciate it, Andrew. Thanks for having me on here. Looking forward to this. Two very different teams than they last time they met at kind of the end of the year.
Also, the thing about the two different teams is the Knicks were becoming a different team that very night. That's the day that they made the OG Anunoby trade. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to call it a schedule loss because like the games were played and like I'm not trying to take anything away from the Pacers, but the Knicks' world was rocked. Like Evan Fournier played in that game. I don't think he's going to play a minute, maybe even a second in this game, even if there is garbage time. And what the Knicks have been since then, as obviously we'll talk about later, is a revelation in how much the OG Anunoby trade has improved their team. But the Pascal Siakam trade, I'm curious, as someone who has not had the chance to watch a ton of Pacers since they've made the Pascal Siakam trade, how are the vibes in Indiana at the moment? How are they adjusting to life since that trade?
Yeah, so it was difficult early on just because of the team circumstances. They were out west for a 6-game road trip when all of this happened. So he flew from Toronto to Indy, checked out, had a physical, and the Pacers do, as it's been told to me, one of the most thorough physicals that there are. And if you may remember Caris LeVert, when they acquired him a couple of years ago, it was a blessing in disguise for Caris because they discovered because of an MRI on his back that he had cancer in his kidney, and all because of that. Long story short. Then he took a private jet out to Portland, met the team up midway through the trip, but no practice time, no shoot around, no real walkthrough too much. And so that's a lot on both sides, both for the current players and for him to be thrust in and not knowing anybody's, how in which they want to play and the team chemistry and all those sorts of things that you got to adapt to in addition to being in a new situation. So they kind of got through that, went 2-4 on that trip, just looked okay. Although in his debut with Tyrese Haliburton, which turned out to be a game where it kept him out for another week and a half because of his hamstring. Didn't look great as they were trying to still figure it out. But then they had a couple practices now. Now they've had a walkthrough. He's starting to ease in and look a lot more comfortable. And I try to put myself in his shoes. And I think from one standpoint there is you don't want to You want to dip your toes in. You don't want to assert yourself too much, even though that's quite literally why the Pacers went out and got him, to be that second guy next to Tyrese, to play both ends, to take on the challenge defensively, which I'm sure we can get into because that's one of the biggest struggles of this Pacers team that they have gotten better at. But against teams with so many good wings, Pacers have nobody that can really stop guys like that. So Pascal helps in that area as well. And so now Tyrese is back into the fold, though on a minutes restriction, and they're just trying to figure it out on the fly here on these dog days of the season.
That actually answers, I think, my next question. It's how healthy is Tyrese Haliburton? You said he's on a minutes restriction. Will he still be on a minutes restriction going into the Garden on Thursday night?
Yeah, Andrew, I'd expect him for indefinitely. And to me, mentally, that means through All-Star break and then see what it looks like. Because he came back at Portland, and I was astounded that he played 35 minutes because I've never had a hamstring issue like that, but I've covered many players with it, and they linger. They usually last longer than players expect. Oftentimes you'll come back and have a setback, or you'll come back and sit out the next game because it just doesn't feel right. So I think right now they really want to get a hold of this so that after All-Star break, it minimizes the impact because he needs to be out there for himself and for the team.
So I just realized this would be the first round matchup if the season ended today. Obviously, not every team has played the same number of games, but this would be the 3-6. And before we talk about how these teams match up, as far as Pacers expectations are concerned, I understand that the boogeyman of the Celtics and what they've been this year has been pretty unstoppable. I know the Pacers just played a pretty hard-fought game where the game that was both in the 120s, and no matter how much good your offense is, it seems like the Celtics always seem to have more. And I'm curious what the expectations are after the Siakam trade. Is 6th, like, just avoid the play-in a reasonable expectation, or are there higher heights set for the Pacers after the trade?
I would start there, quite frankly.
Okay.
And let's reset too before the season. This team has not made the playoffs since 2020, since the pandemic year. They've had 3 coaches since then. That was Nate McMillan. They had the year experiment with Nate Bjorkgren from Toronto. That didn't go well, much like Adrian Griffin and everything up in Milwaukee. And then now Rick Carlisle, who signed a contract extension, I should note, before the season. But this is kind of that third iteration. They haven't won a playoff series since Paul George in 2014. So both the Knicks and the Pacers are kind of on the rise, certainly, and 2 teams that should start making some noise and have made these big trades over the last year to try to help their chances. Now, going into this season, the focus was just getting back in the playoffs. That's what it was about. I had them at I had them at 500 record, 41, 42-ish wins. They've played ahead of that, to be sure, especially with their success in the in-season tournament. Going 7-1 there was huge. But then adding Siakam into this roster and added to this piece, to me, that's exactly what, to me, it is. It's to finish 5th or 6th, to have no question, not have to mess with a play-in tournament, and potentially win a first-round series.
So you mentioned the in-season tournament. I'm actually curious. I was going to look it up, what their record is since the tournament and how much of an effect that's had. I know I'm honestly at a loss for how much it mattered, how much it took a toll on guys. Like I brought up the Sixers a lot and what it did for their season, in that it gave them because they missed the in-season tournament, they got an extra game against Washington and Atlanta. And then the Knicks, their reward for making the tournament was an extra road game at Milwaukee and then at Boston, because the Pacers ended up beating the Sixers in the consolation game. And so it's quite the reward for making the tournament. You get 2 games against these 2 elite teams. Did the Pacers benefit at all, or was it more of a detriment having to play that high leverage basketball in the middle of December? I'm curious from your perspective, what you think it would be.
Yeah, and if the Pacers had lost to, it would have been Milwaukee, I think, in Indy, they would have went to New York and played a road game at New York. So it's funny how those things work out. And I think those are the little quirks of scheduling, particularly after the tournament. That's nobody's to blame, but those are kind of the unforeseen things and things they need to figure out, because the answer to your question is twofold. Starting with, undoubtedly, it was a huge success for this Pacers franchise. They were all in. They treated this like it was a semifinals of the conference. Because, quite frankly, this team hasn't done anything as a group. Miles Turner's been around for some of that pre-existing success that goes back when he was drafted in 2015. But outside of him, I mean, Buddy Hield's got the most games played in the league without a playoff appearance. Tyrese, who's a rising star in this league, has yet to experience the playoffs. That's why he wanted to play with Team USA and did. That's why during training camp, he talked about, all I want to do is win. This season's all about winning. I got my contract. I got better players. I want to win and get to the playoffs, something I have never experienced before. So that's why, to go back to the last question too, it's all about getting to the playoffs. Forget how it ends. So the tournament was a huge success, Andrew. 7-1, only the loss in the Lakers just because they didn't have the firepower there in Vegas. Then after that was a challenge exactly like the Lakers, both because scheduling and kind of the wear down from that, the letdown. But the Pacers, I think, went on the road for like their next 4 games straight from Vegas. So that road trip, I think, turned out to be something like 6 games in 14 days, all on the road. So that was terribly unfortunate. Again, you could say like scheduled losses to some extent. Like they went to Washington and lost. Like that's a tough one to take. But in the aggregate, it was easily a huge win for this Pacers team to experience, to be part of, to get the bonus money, to get the national recognition as well. Because the other night at Boston, that was their only nationally televised game that was scheduled for the season. That's it. But because of the in-season tournament, they played 4 in a row, including on 3 different networks. That's exposure this team doesn't get.
I was about to say, that's the thing I remember when talking about the tournament, is that the Pacers hadn't been scheduled. Like Tyrese was saying, like, this is big for me because I haven't played on national television yet. I don't know if it was his career, because I don't remember.
It was TNT.
It was on
never
TNT.
Played on
he hadn't
TNT
played
game.
on TNT, right? So he gets to be on TNT for the first time, leading up to that performance. And look, I became a believer in Haliburton over that tournament. I think this season in general has caused a lot of people to become more believers in his game and in his play style, and to not focus so much on what the defense has been. I'm curious about I mean, the Lakers presented somewhat of a blueprint on how to not quote unquote stop him, and it's to just take away the transition game and to make somebody else beat you. If you get rid of the pick and roll game, is he able to beat you in the half court in different ways? And I imagine the Knicks are going to do similar things in this matchup, with especially if OG Anunoby's healthy and they're able to just blitz him consistently, whether it be with Quentin Grimes and DiVincenzo, and then OG just taking the responsibility himself. How do you think these two teams match up? I know, again, the last game is just, it's impossible to take anything out of, but the Knicks' ability to really shrink the court with how many just premium defenders that they have, it's almost like it's which extreme are you going to take? The Knicks defense since the OG trade, or what the historically great offense the Pacers have been this year?
So what's worked against the Pacers is one, have a lockdown defender. And the guy that always comes to mind for me in the recent years is Minnesota's Jaden McDaniels. He's done a really good job guarding Tyrese and eliminating him, because if you minimize his impact, then you help your chances to win. You can win in other ways, but that's the most effective way. And I thought the Lakers did a great job of throwing a couple defenders at Tyrese, picking him up full court, just making everything so difficult. And I remember coming out of that tournament, what I wrote is, hey, look, this is the next phase in Tyrese's career, is facing additional pressure, being the guy and having to adapt to that. And so sometimes we saw the team adapt to Rick Carlisle playing him off the ball. And so instead of being the one to screen for, maybe he would come set screens and things like that. Or he would be out on the court as a threat, and they'd sometimes play away from him. Those were certain things. Now, that hasn't been as big of an issue here in recent games. It was more so right after the tournament while it was still fresh in everyone's mind. But you talk about this matchup, the first thing that comes to mind is just the style of play of the Knicks and how they are built. I go back to what certain things Rick has really emphasized. I mean, remember asking him in the preseason, how'd you set up a game like this? Did you really like the contrasting styles? Because they also scheduled a Memphis game, and like they are all about running, gunning, getting guys out on the run and such, especially. I think at that time, maybe their pace was right there with the Pacers, for example, high scoring. And then you go to the Knicks, and it's all about physicality, grit, toughness, bully ball, which you don't see too much of anymore. And that's what I think we all really appreciate, the way in which Tom Thibodeau and the Knicks play is kind of a style that's gone out of style, but it still works so effectively, essentially. And so the contrast in styles here will be interesting, and so too will be the way in which they use OG and Anunoby. Those two going against each other with Pascal Siakam for the first time. That's a fun storyline. And I got to mention it because I'm thinking about it. It's been cool the last week. The Westchester Knicks were in town. And so as part of that, Jacob Toppin on a two-way was here. And for the first game, the Pacers were in town. So Obi was able to sit courtside in both celebrating with him, but also talking smack with Jacob during the game, which was phenomenal. In the last game that Obi could not attend, I think on Monday night, he went off and scored a franchise record 30 points in the first half. So that was fun to see, the brotherly love, and Obi being able to attend Jacob's games on Obi's home court. I kind of like the storylines between those two.
I got to say, that's what made the January 30th game December 30th game so surreal. Like, a lot of Knicks fans had attachments to RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley. And we woke up that morning like, oh, it's the first time they're going to play Obi. And then it was a reminder that all three of these guys are no longer in attendance. Then any of the attention of that being Obi's first time against the Knicks just got completely taken away, which leads us into this matchup where Obi comes back to Madison Square Garden for the first time. Now, I admittedly, when I check in on the Pacers and I watch some games, at times it's just been to see how Obi's doing. At times it's just because the Pacers pre-Siakam trade were the greatest show on turf or on court, on the hardwood, what do you want to call it? Just the first to 130. It was just a really fun way to watch a basketball game. And I know he was taken out of the starting five, but I want to give a shout out to one of our staffers. His name is XJ, who was a huge believer in Obi Toppin and still is, and has been. He might watch the Pacers more than either of us, to be completely honest, because he wants to see him in a different setting than how Tibbs used him. And he's been stern that we do not call him a backup. We just say they changed his role. They redistributed his minutes.
Gotcha.
And I'm here for the semantics. If you want to defend your boy, but I also do think that's a fair clarification. And I wanted to, as somebody who's watched more than me this season, but most of Obi's minutes this year.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that like they just found a role that was better for him, that wasn't in the starting lineup, and it balanced out, like it gave the starting five more defense, and obviously he's now behind Siakam, so he is technically Siakam's backup, but that doesn't mean that they don't share the court together. That Friday night game that just happened where he had the heroic slate, like they shared the floor together. So like he's obviously been better and shown more than what he was given in New York, but how would you grade Obi so far this year? And, you know, like has his role not even changed at all? It's really just his minute. Have his minutes not changed? I think that's the way I'm trying to ask the question. But his role is just different because he's coming off the bench in this new rotation. So
the first change was strategic. It had nothing to do necessarily with him doing something wrong or whatever. Right. Rick Carlisle said, hey, we're piling up losses. We got to start making a defensive priority. They had a big practice on December 19th. It was their first practice because of the in-season tournament. To go back to that, they had like no practice time. First practice since like the end of November in 3 weeks. And so they really locked in on defense during that practice. On top of that, the coaching staff really wanted to emphasize defense, toughness, and physicality, and add size to the starting lineup. So before the trade to get Pascal Siakam to Indiana, they were, starting Jalen Smith again at the 4 spot. He started last year at the 4. It hurt them more than it helped them. So about 25 games in, they moved him back to the backup 5, and Aaron Nesmith started. Well, they went back to Aaron Nesmith starting at the 3. Jalen Smith at the 4, and then bringing Pascal in. Then I think it's fair to say Obi's the backup. Like no one's going to argue, I don't think here, that Pascal's not far and away better player than Obi Toppin. Now, in doing so, the difference is here is he's playing a little bit less, I think, with Tyrese Haliburton in that starting group that really wants to run. That was the big offseason thing they emphasized, is how it was Tyrese, it was Bruce Brown, and it was Obi Toppin, 3 of the top 4 players in transition and efficiency. Well, Bruce is gone. Obi's coming off the bench. So you're seeing a little bit less of that. In turn, you're also seeing defense and opponents held to fewer points. Thankfully, thank goodness. I was tired of watching just an embarrassment of defense. Like they would all acknowledge that. That's not me,
No, it's funny that you're saying you hate watching it, and out of town we were like, oh, the Pacers are on today. Let's see if they can score 150 tonight.
Because that's what it became, and the Pacers have scored 150, I think 2 or 3 times this season, including I think both times against Atlanta. If I have to watch Pacers in Atlanta, like that is not reasonable basketball. It is a step above the All-Star game where defense is optional and points are at will. To me, that's not a professional basketball game. So it did feel like, what are we doing here? Now, high scoring games, I'm all for, and good offense, absolutely. But there's also got to be the challenge and players willing to take on the challenge, which has been a thing here of defending, of playing their role. And so in terms of Bruce being away, you're seeing Nesmith, Nembhard, and obviously Siakam leaned on more for perimeter defense. And inside, that's where you got Pascal, who can really guard any position out there. Miles holds it down in the forward. And in doing so, in the aggregate here, the last 6 weeks or so, the defense has been average, and that's fine.
Okay. So that's where Obi falls in. Do you see him on the team on the other side of the deadline? I know they just made a move for a power forward, and he's a restricted free agent this offseason.
Right, so. But also that means they can match any deal that's put out there.
That's true.
So
that's true.
I think they were willing to have some potential extension talks in the fall, and I understand that from Obi's standpoint is, hey, let's see how this season plays out. I don't even know what I look with Tyrese. I don't know how I look playing more than 16 minutes per game in Tibbs' system and all of that. Let's see how I can do, and I'm going to bet on myself is kind of what he wanted from that standpoint. I would not be surprised if he's back with the Pacers next season. So I don't feel an urgency for them to necessarily move him. Now, if he's involved in a package, you could understand it. The other guy that you could is a guy like Buddy Hield, who's in a contract year. You would not necessarily bring him back, or right now, I don't think they could agree on a price tag on that either. So we'll see what that looks like. But in terms of the trade deadline, that's why you would be more apt to move a guy like Buddy because of his circumstances. He's older, doesn't exactly fit the same timeline.
So, it's funny. The Knicks currently have a guy named Quentin Grimes that is being mentioned in trade talks. And we're in the fan base kind of like just wait till the summer to do this. If like he will contribute to playoff rotations if you just let him play, and he's actually played really well since the first report of the
funny how that happens.
Funny how suddenly you're on the trade block and you're actually, it's not even he was playing that poorly, just wasn't being used as much. And Tibbs has actually stretched him another 5 minutes and not playing OG Anunoby 100 minutes a game.
I don't envy though. By the way, I don't envy guys in that position. What you'll see here is over this next week, it'll be contentious on some of these rosters. Those rosters that you expect to make some deals, and we always go to LeBron's team, but that's uncomfortable waters to kind of be in that locker room. We saw it here many years ago. If you go back, and the Pacer fans were incredible. And when LeBron was at the line or other players, it was LeBron's going to trade you. It's one of the all-time great interactions throughout the entire game. Fans did that. But guess what? Pacers like blew him out by like 40. And you could just feel the tension on that Lakers roster, not knowing, are they going to get moved today, tomorrow, the next day? There was like 3 or 4 days before the deadline. So for the teams probably going to make deals, that is a real thing for the next week.
That was the Lonzo Ball, Brandon Ingram, Josh Hart, like those guys.
That sounds
Kyle
right.
Kuzma team. Yeah, LeBron was, because the rumor was 2 weeks before, or the report was 2 weeks before, that Anthony Davis had asked for a trade. So every night you could have just shouted at any random Laker, LeBron's going to trade you. And guess what? He did that offseason. The reason I bring up Quentin Grimes is I think that's where my mind went to with Obi, that he went to Indiana thinking this is a fresh start. I'm the starting 4. Midway through the season, he gets moved to the bench role, even though the minutes are still there. And now he's back behind an all-star power forward. I don't know if you could tell from him if there was any frustration that he's now in a similar position, although still given the opportunity to play a little bit more. He's not like playing 8 to 15 minutes like he was.
Yeah, or sparingly.
You know,
like there are games he wouldn't play.
And he's not just like corner to corner. Like he's actually being used a little bit more in the offense, right?
It felt like from afar with the Knicks, he was used almost on a need basis. Versus in the Pacers, he's absolutely in the rotation. They know what they're getting from him. He provides an entirely different dynamic, both running in transition. His mid-range, I forget the stat, but I think he was like top 3 in the league in 2-point percentage. Like, it was remarkable. He had been so efficient there. He's improved on his rebounding. And defense has been okay. I thought especially the first month and a half of the season, somewhat understandably, he would be out of position. I could easily pick up on the TV broadcast Miles Turner yelling at him, trying to get him in the right spots, things like that. But I'm also cognizant of how he acknowledged like what he's being asked in Rick Carlisle's system defensively is entirely different than what he was doing for Tom Thibodeau. And so it's hard to break old habits. It's the combination of breaking old habits and learning the new offense. So I acknowledge that the first month and a half of the season. And I think he's done a nice job settling in. And also to answer your questions too more directly, I'm not getting any negative vibe from him. I think he really relishes his fresh start. I think he appreciates how he can kind of be under the radar here. Like, New York's home, and that is terribly difficult. I've seen that covering former players, and I'm talking the hometown thing, not as much the New York thing, because I've sensed that here, even in Indiana. We had Jeff Teague, George Hill, and a lot of those guys came early or midway through their contract, and the demands and what's asked of you is so tough, even beyond the court, from ticket requests to pay my cell phone bill to, hey, you're the hometown hero, you should be doing this. And so I wonder how much he felt that. Plus, I'm not in the rotation. Plus, I'm a lottery pick for the Knicks, must live up to those expectations. You kind of shed those labels a little bit once you get moved. And I think that has been freeing. And I also will go back, Andrew, to our first practice of the game, the first training camp practice of the season. He came up, there's only 3 beat writers. He comes, talks with us. I think we talked for like 8 minutes. We're out of questions. He's like, that's it? Oh, that's easy. And walked away. It's a totally different environment here. And I think, and I know that it's clearly been something that he's appreciated from all elements on the court and off.
I forget who the player was, but there was I'm a huge Mets fan, and there was a Mets first baseman. It was Ike Davis. That's who it was. He got traded to Pittsburgh, and he was like, I just went to Starbucks and got coffee randomly. Like, I wasn't bothered on my way to there about my swing or being told where I need to be positioned. There wasn't like 3 beat writers like waiting for me when I arrived at the stadium. I just kind of went, took my swings, and left. It's just a different market, not a worse market. It's just it's different, like you said, and that's where It's
and
where
then not
like,
being
look,
in your hometown ish. So
so that's the other part about
that's
Obi that
the other part.
I appreciate too, is that he like the New York of it all. It's literally where you grew up, and your family is able to go to every game, and there's some distance from it. It's like the Indiana of it all, like he's not that far from Dayton where he went to school. So we'll see. Where I know Dayton's in Ohio, by the way. I'm just making sure.
There's been a lot of support. That's a good point for you to bring up, because I'll see it both on Twitter mentions and like the Dayton fans following or retweeting. And then also you'll see fans with Dayton gear in the stands. So he even in the offseason held a basketball camp over there. So he kind of has a secondary home with Dayton, which I think all makes this a little bit more comfortable. But he's able to get out of that New York bubble and kind of breathe. It felt like is the perception I felt for the first time in 4 years.
I think the evaluation we gave him about a week ago, we were talking about like the Knicks that are no longer here, the kids that are no longer here, is like it's the Knicks don't miss him in the sense that like we weren't able to replace what they lost in Obi Toppin. Like what DiVincenzo has been has honestly been a revelation, because he's now their starting two, and it's one of the best starting backcourts that they've had in like 50 years. But like it's very clear to say that the Knicks didn't use him enough or maximize what his potential was, and he's absolutely boosted his value. And that's why we've actually had like a pretty fun season as Knicks fans, being able to watch the kids that they drafted on different teams.
That's
I'm able to say it because of how older I am than Obi Toppin, but like these prospects that went to other teams and got to be used differently, while also being able to watch the Knicks who are really good. And like they're 14-2 since the Anunoby trade. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm curious your thoughts from afar about OG Anunoby and the Knicks and how sustainable all of this is. And it's going to lead to a Bruce Brown question, because you got to cover him and be closer to him than any of us were. Like, do you see like Bruce Brown as a good fit on the Knicks? Should they pursue him at this upcoming trade deadline?
Yeah, with Bruce in particular, I'm curious what he would garner now, like on the second time, because you do have to pay what's left of his $22 million contract, but it's basically an expiring deal. To me, my initial thought was, being that expensive, it probably takes the contenders out of it. But then you consider they might have a bad contract or two that they would not mind offloading, a guy that has not worked out. So maybe it's actually
Evan Fournier. Yeah, Evan Fournier hasn't played, I think, over 300 minutes this year. Maybe 100 minutes is stretching it.
There you go.
Maybe 50 now that I'm thinking about it. And he's got an $18 million contract. We've done the math. Brown for Fournier and whatever the pick is works. So I think that's the pick. That's the trade I think Knicks fans are eyeing that could potentially happen. We'll get upset if it's Quentin Grimes and Evan Fournier for Bruce Brown on an expiring. But,
plus there's the obvious connection too. He's represented by CAA.
Where's his agent? Exactly.
CAA Knicks. So
yes,
it makes a lot of sense from that standpoint as well, if they can come together and make it work. And Thibodeau loves defense and toughness. And that's exactly what Bruce did and provided here. He really, I think the biggest thing that I felt that he provided to this team was a vision. He could talk about what it was like going to the championships. He could talk about being the underdog as a player and working his way up, both individually and on a championship team, and being the sum of the parts, which is what it was in Denver, along with Jokic, obviously, not trying to under that. But they all knew their role, loved their role, appreciated it, didn't question it. And those are so many things. Like Bruce and Tyrese helped host a players mini camp in the offseason right before the season. They did it down in Nashville because he loves country music, because he loves all that, and he wanted Tyrese especially to experience that. But through all that, I mean, think about it. He's a newcomer. He's still relatively young, and he took on some leadership. He could go off of that previous experience and really add that to a younger team that's on the cusp, much like I feel like the Knicks are right now. So it would make a lot of sense, especially since they have that contract that you mentioned right there that the Knicks would not mind getting off of. It's just, it all goes back to what is Masai Ujiri thinking here and what's he willing to do? Because good luck guessing what he thinks. The last couple of years, we've all had that concerns, right? Pacers tried to get in on OG Anunoby. My understanding is they were second in trying to get to them before Masai just pulled the trigger and said, you know what, I'm going to do this Knicks deal. I like it. We're getting real pieces rather than draft picks. Let's keep it moving. And then dealt with Pascal. But Pacers had been trying to get those two players for at least going back to last season.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how these two former Raptors match up against each other. If, again, and I know we missed the last 2 games with an elbow injury. We'll see if he plays on Thursday night. Last question before I let you get out of here. And I know like you cover the team, so it's a little different than what I usually ask fans that do to these podcasts, but I usually try to get the Mount Rushmore of rivals. But from your experience, I guess, as a journalist,
sure,
like I'll ask like the cities that you've traveled to that you look forward to the most. And I guess you could correct me if I'm wrong about how often you travel covering the team, but like the NBA cities that you enjoy the most as far as covering the team is concerned.
Okay.
Who are the 4 cities that you look forward to on the NBA calendar?
First of all, take kind of where you're headed with the first question. And right now, excluding like the huge big time histories, I'm talking Lakers, Celtics, like it doesn't seem like there's any rivalries. Like the NBA did this rivalry week.
Well, yeah.
I'm sitting back. I'm like, Pacers don't have a rivalry. Yeah, the Knicks and Pacers, Hicks versus Knicks, that was incredible. But that was decades ago. You could say Pacers Heat from a decade ago when LeBron was down there and they pushed them to the conference finals back-to-back years. We're 1 game away from the finals for just a second time. That was barely a rivalry because the Pacers hadn't beaten. I'm very stickler on things like that.
I hear you. Listen, Knicks Heat still gets me up. And to be honest, Knicks Pacers still gets me up. The bloodbaths of the 90s.
And it almost feels like it was because the 90s and because Reggie Miller's still around. He was commentating on the Pacers last game in Boston. Donnie Walsh, that connection and how he's beloved and was really a foundational piece to really help what this Pacers franchise has been since the 80s and having the longest tenured owner in Herb Simon. But in terms of NBA stops, you could take that a number of different ways. I will first say the appeal of something like New York is the people. So connecting with a lot of national media is fun while I'm out there. Agents are based there. Fashion people, now that's become a thing, right, for the Pacers. Like I know Tyrese Haliburton talked on local radio today, said he met with the commissioner, Adam Silver. He had a meeting, had to go to a watch shop to get things fixed. He was going to go shop. Those are the different things that you can do there. It also doesn't, it's hard to top kind of that December trip to New York and Rockefeller and all that. Other than that, I would say most oftentimes I would lean warm just because this is no exaggeration. We have not seen the sun in 10 plus days. Like I would love to go to Miami right now, Orlando, something like that. Here's my answer though, to wind it up.
Yeah,
There's a few cities that still have good media seats. Therefore, you can really provide the best coverage. And so to me, out of all of it, that's most important because that directly impacts my coverage and what fans can read. So what you're talking about there, you're thinking Orlando, Oklahoma City, Memphis, Phoenix, I think is still in that group. But LA, you can put LA as well on the baseline about 4 rows back. But I really appreciate that because you can really take hold of conversation with officials, with coaches, maybe players bantering back and forth, whether it's good natured or whether it's frustrations, etc. So that's my answer. It's where the good seats remain in the NBA because there aren't very many of them.
And I know that the Knicks beat sits at like this bird's eye view of the whole
up in the
whole
corner.
arena. Yeah, like it's this really high up view that's not as intimate as it used to be when the media seats were closer to the court. So
yeah,
look, in my very limited time with a media hat on in college when I covered college football, I can appreciate both the bird's eye view and then from the college basketball perspective, the courtside view. So I can empathize with that sentiment of needing as close a seat to the court as possible for sure.
I can't tell you how many stories used to sometimes come up out of, this was the interaction. This is why Rick was frustrated. Rick Carlisle was frustrated with that call, or this is why that player deserved the technical or did not, or this is what ticked him off. You have no feel for that, quite frankly, anymore. I have at Pacer home games, you're up at the top of club level. I have my iPad to have the game broadcast. I have AirPods so I can hear that. I have binoculars so I can look around the arena. Not a criticism. It's just a very different experience. And so you try to make the most of it because you understand, hey, look, we're just media. While we do provide a value at the same time, if they can sell a courtside seat for, I don't know, $500 each or whatever it goes for, the business sense generally says, take the money.
Yeah, it's actually like the most, like, I don't say important, but like it's the most popular story I ever got to put out there in college was like a kid that was like a senior he didn't play the entire like last 8 minutes. So after the second to last media timeout, he didn't play the last 8 minutes for a sophomore that played over him. And he was sat there pouting the entire time. And I noticed it. And I went and asked him about it after the game. And he was like, "Oh, you saw that, didn't you?" And it's like, yes, I'm sitting 5 feet away from you. Of course I'm going to notice that. And of course it gained some traction. But I'm curious about this matchup on Thursday night. If OG Anunoby plays, I like the Knicks' chances. If he doesn't, I'm curious to see if the fighting Knicks are actually still that deep and can take on this track meet that they're going to have to do with the Pacers. And I'm curious to see, what the final outcome is. The important part is that we got to have a good conversation about it. And I appreciate you, Scott, for making the time for me. Before you get out of here, please let the fine folks at home know where they can find you and all of your stuff.
For sure. Thanks for having me on. I also want to preface too, haven't seen the latest injury report, but Miles Turner, Jalen Smith, both been dealing with back issues, sore backs, back spasms the last several weeks. We know Haliburton's going to be on a minutes restriction. Benedict Mathurin suffered a great big toe injury 2 games ago, did not play. So I'm curious to see what he'll look like coming back. And TJ McConnell has had an illness that kept him out of game. I think got sick from his kid, which I'm sure many parents can relate to. So the Pacers could be undermanned for the second straight game, which even if OG's out, then that adds a whole new development, I think, to what we may potentially see coming up in this one. But
two teams looking forward to the All-Star break, it sounds like.
Everybody is getting out. Absolutely. Yeah, by the way, I will love it, though, because it's right here in Indianapolis. So
that's right. Everybody's going to you for the All-Star break.
So we are looking forward to that.
You mentioned going to warm weather. My All-Star break is going to be in Miami. So I'm actually doing the thing you said. I prefer warmer weather than going to New York, Yeah,
good for you. That's awesome. And otherwise, I do a Substack like many people, many reporters in the league. So you can subscribe to that at fieldhousefiles.com. I also have a Fieldhouse Files podcast where I put out an episode basically once a week. And so, and then it's just my name at Scott Agness on Twitter and on Instagram.
We're very knowledgeable of the Substack world with the Knicks Film School newsletter on Substack. So Knicks fans, you know what to do. Let's flood the newsletter, the Fieldhouse Files newsletter. Get all your Pacers information there. And Scott, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, man. Thanks.